Is Alan Wake an overrated horror game? I just beat Alan Wake for the first time ever, and I have a lot to say about it. So strap in. This one's gonna get bumpy. This game was released in 2010, and over the years, the first Alan Wake has seen some very positive reception. Many people praised this game for its somewhat confusing but great storytelling, its unique but slightly repetitive combat, and the game's thrilling atmosphere. But the game has also seen some very negative criticism, reviewers calling this game repetitive, and others even going as far to straight up calling it boring. And I am here to say that both sides are right. There will be spoilers for the entire game in this video, so let's get into it. The intro in this game is amazing. It sets up the story, it does everything that it needs to do. I love the mix of interactive cutscenes and cinematic cutscenes. You have these in-the-moment cutscenes where you're actually there in the scene, and then throughout the game you get CG cutscenes, which I think blends really well with the gameplay. And at the beginning of the game, Alan Wake has this sort of attitude, and at first I was like, why is he like this? I feel like this is a character that I'm not gonna like. Basically, Alan Wake, he's a best-selling writer, and he has writer's block. You know, his creativity is kind of just trapped in his own mind, and he wants to go on vacation with his wife to hopefully get some more inspiration to clear his thoughts. And Alan's wife in this game is one of the best characters. Honestly, every character in this game is really good. There wasn't a character that I absolutely hated or a character that I just couldn't stand. Barry's another character who is basically like Alan's best friend essentially.
If you have business with Mr. Wake, you talk to me. You yokels won't know what hit you once I sick my lawyers on your asses.
He's one of the highlights of this game, and I thought he was a great addition. And then again, going back to Alan's wife, she is a very supportive character. The voice acting is pretty good for the most part. It does become a little inconsistent because there are some times in the game where the voice acting is really good.
Barry, we're headed to the dam in one of the pipes. Meet us there.
Okay, I'll tell Sarah.
It's Sarah now? Barry! Barry!
And then other times it's off, you know, it feels like they kind of just walked in the audio booth and just started talking in the mic without actually delivering some emotion in their lines.
I used to have these nightmares when I was a kid. The dark really spooked me too. When it got really bad, my mom gave me this old light switch. She called it the clicker.
The game also has a lot of collectibles, and more specifically, there are these pages that you can collect, and they basically narrate what happens throughout the game. And I think this is a really cool, I guess, feature. And you actually want to read these pages because some of them give you very useful tips for the future, you know, later in the game. And I love how Alan Wake narrates over the gameplay.
There was no power. There was bound to be a generator somewhere at the logging site.
Alan is commentating over, you know, basically explaining what's going on. And in a lot of games, I don't find myself standing still and just really paying attention to the environment. Usually I'm going, you know, from point A to point B to point C. But in this game, I found myself multiple times stopping and just appreciating the environment.
The water was clear but dark. It looked very deep.
And throughout the game, you know, there's TVs that are playing like episodes from different shows. And I found myself multiple times stopping to actually watch these episodes.
With each pull of the trigger, two new realities branch off. One in which the weapon didn't fire, and one where it did. With my machine here, I have ensured that this reality is always the former.
The environmental storytelling in this game is so good, and it's so well done. I like the concept in this game on how your art is essentially turned into reality. I mean, imagine writing a book and then it comes to life. I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? If there's one thing about the story that I would truly criticize, it's the ending. I just felt like it could have been a lot better. The build up, the final boss, I mean, those two things I just feel like were completely just done wrong. But enough about the story, let's let's talk about combat. The combat in this game is surprisingly really fun. However, it can be clunky at times. There were multiple times where I got stuck, and sometimes you get backed into a corner and there's like 5 or 6 enemies coming at you. And if you don't have any flashbangs or flares which you can use to stun the enemies, then you're basically screwed. But the combat is very deep, surprisingly. For a game this old, you can use flashbangs to insta-kill the enemies. You can also use flares and a flare gun to blind the enemies. It doesn't kill them instantly, but it blinds them. I mean, the weapon variety, surprisingly, is pretty decent. Overall, the gameplay is very simple. You point your flashlight or any form of light to stun the enemy. But this is the point in the game that just starts to frustrate me, and this is where the game starts to lose my attention. You get to a point in the game where you start fighting flying objects. No, I'm not kidding. You start fighting tractors and bulldozers and flying barrels, and I'm just like, what? It wouldn't have been so bad, because at first I was like, okay, this is kind of cool. All right, this is a little different. It's a little unique. I'm cool with this. But then you literally jump into a boss fight with a giant bulldozer, and I'm like, who designed this? Why am I fighting ghost tractors and bulldozers and, flying crates and tires and cars? I mean, what? And I get it, right? The whole concept in this world is the darkness is taking over. So the darkness has control of everything. It has control of your cell phones, of cars and vehicles and anything it wants. And you remember how I said the final boss was very disappointing? Well, for the final boss, you literally fight a tornado. The game also has this very crazy obsession with taking your weapons away. I wish I kept track, but throughout the game takes away your weapons at least like 10 times. But there were times where I have like an entire arsenal of weapons, and then all of a sudden our characters go off to the next area, and I'm back to just having a pistol. One thing I do really like about this game as well is how the enemies throw things at you. Like they throw their axes or hatchets, whatever else they got. And it reminds me a lot of the Ganados from Resident Evil 4, how they also throw their weapons at you. And I also love how the enemies actually react to my gunshots. I feel like a lot of video games nowadays, and even a lot of video games and action games at the time, enemies in a lot of video games are bullet spongy for some reason. Whereas in Alan Wake, every time you shoot an enemy, you stun them. And my favorite part in this entire game was probably the farm scene.
Please, please, please!
Now, let's talk about the difficulty of the game. So ultimately, even though this is a quote-unquote horror game, it's also an action game, right? It's an action horror game. And I feel like at times, this game is very unbalanced. Like they throw 10 enemies at you, but barely give you any ammo. And later in the game, they throw way more ammo at you, and I think that's how it should have been from the start. And it's not like I was missing my shots. Like I was hitting pretty much all of my shots all throughout this game. So when you have 3 enemies running at you from in front of you, and then you have 2 more enemies behind you, and you have like 7 bullets, and on top of that, remember, you can't just shoot these enemies right away. You have to stun them with the flashlight, which takes time, and then you get to shoot them. And imagine having to do that for like 8 different enemies at once. At times, it definitely becomes clunky and frustrating. And of course, this is a 2010 game, so there are going to be bugs. I mean, every video game has bugs. There was a part where I got stuck on the generator and this enemy was just stun locking me, but when they punch you, they don't do any damage. This is almost like the shove mechanic from the RE4 remake where the Ganados just shove you. They don't actually do damage. And I gotta say, the entire third act of this game, while it does have its moments, I felt like it was the weakest part of the game. Because by the third act in the game just says, screw it, and they start throwing everything they got at you. They start throwing flocks of birds at you, they throw constant waves of enemies at you, and I feel like this is a good concept, but it definitely could have been executed a lot better. There's also this slow motion effect, which literally happens every 10 seconds in this game. Anytime an enemy jumps out at you from your sides or from behind you, there is a slow motion effect that happens. And at first I was like, okay, this is kind of cinematic. This is kind of cool. But it gets to a point very early on in the game where it becomes very annoying. I'm running, boom, slow motion effect. Okay, cool. They're showing me where the enemies are coming from. Okay, I got it. 10 seconds later, more enemies jump out, slow motion effect. Okay, game, I get it, right? There's enemies jumping out. Let me look at the enemies for myself. Another 20 seconds later and another slow, and I'm just like, game, I get it. The hitboxes in this game can also be a little wonky. There's a part in the game where there's like this, you know, train car rolling down, and clearly you can see it rolls over my head, but no, the hitboxes are just like, you're dead. All right, so I have a lot of issues with the game. Some things I really like, but what about the graphics? Keep in mind, I didn't play the remastered version. I played the original version that came out that was ported to PC, and wow, for a game that's this old, it is gorgeous. And the music in this game, the combat themes, a lot of the ambience themes, I mean, it is really good. Major props to the music composer of this game, because wow. Oh, and did I mention that this game has 2 DLC chapters? And wow, what a massive disappointment. So the first DLC chapter for this game, I believe is called The Signal. I'm just gonna say it how it is. This is the most unnecessary chapter in the entire game. I feel like you don't do anything in this chapter. It doesn't really progress the story. Sure, you get some extra lore pieces, but that's about it. It doesn't progress the story. You don't fight any new and interesting enemies. And the boss fight of this chapter is probably the worst boss in the entire game. You got enemies spawning out of nowhere. You have to stun these like TV screens, and on top of that you got these giant objects being thrown at you. Who designed this? I'm usually not someone to complain about difficulty in video games because I love when games are challenging. I love when they're difficult, when they're challenging, when the game throws everything it has at me. I love when games do that. But there's also a fine line between a challenging game and a game that's just poorly designed, and I feel like this is a game that perfectly sets up that exact example. And then we have the second DLC chapter, The Writer, and this one is a lot better than the first one. And this chapter actually gets pretty creative, and I wish the main game was more like this chapter. Then there's this scene right here where you walk into this room and this entire room turns into like this elevator lift thingy where you have to go through these different rooms. I mean, it's cool, it's creative, and I wish the main game did more things like this. And I'm hoping Alan Wake 2 does more things like this because this was cool. This DLC chapter was fun. Alan Wake is a great game. It's definitely not a masterpiece or a perfect horror game, but yes, I do think this game is slightly overrated, just slightly. That doesn't mean it's a bad game. It doesn't mean it doesn't deserve the praise, but it's not this 9 out of 10 and 10 out of 10 game that everybody was telling me that it was. If I were to rate this game, it's somewhere between a 7 and an 8. And now I want to hear your thoughts. Thank you all for watching, and until next time.